some of the rioters who stormed the United States Capitol on January 6th could face sedition charges as the investigation intensifies. Now, this would mean some of the 400 people already charged could officially be accused of trying to overthrow the U.S. government. Michael Sherwin, the former top prosecutor who was leading the investigation, addressed this in a new interview with 60 Minutes. He says the evidence is trending towards those sedition charges.
I'm not a lawyer, but the way I read the sedition statute, it says that sedition occurs when anyone opposes by force the authority of the United States or by force hinders or delays the execution of any law of the United States. Seems like a very low bar, and I wonder why you're not charging that now.
Okay, so I don't think it's a low bar, Scott, but I will tell you this. I personally believe the evidence is trending towards that and probably meets those elements.
Do you anticipate sedition charges against some of these suspects?
I believe the facts do support those charges, and I think that as we go forward, more facts will support that, Scott.
So for more on this, let's bring in CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes. Nancy, can you explain the significance of possible sedition charges? Why haven't the suspected rioters already been charged with it?
Because it's a very rare statute that isn't often used successfully. To prove seditious conspiracy, you need to show, first of all, that individuals worked with one another to overthrow the government, and that's the goal that they were all working towards. Not that they wanted to prop up Donald Trump or show their support for him, but that they were actively trying to overthrow the government of the United States. And so you can certainly see prosecutors arguing that this is a charge that might apply to some individuals and certainly not all. Perhaps those individuals that had worked together in the weeks leading up to the Capitol insurrection, communicated about what kinds of weapons they might bring, how they might work in concert to try to break into the Capitol building. It's more than just saying these people broke into a government building where they weren't supposed to be and sort of messed up the gears of government for a little while. You'd have to prove that they really wanted to bring down the U.S. government. And the last time that seditious conspiracy was used successfully was back in 1995. It had to do with the original 1993 World Trade Center bombing. So it's typically been used, and again, it's been used quite rarely, against, say, al-Qaeda cells in the United States. And that may be why it's taking quite a while for prosecutors to decide to actually go that route this time around.
So, Nancy, let's switch gears here. Let me ask you about what's going on at the southern border. Homeland Security Chief Alejandro Mayorkas defended the administration's response during recent interviews over the weekend. Let me play a bit of what he had to say.
Border is closed. We are expelling families. We are expelling single adults. And we've made a decision that we will not expel young, vulnerable children. I think we are executing on our plans, and quite frankly, when we are finished doing so, the American public will look back on this and say we secured our border and we upheld our values and our principles as a nation.
So, Nancy, does the Biden administration have a concrete plan to address the situation at the border moving forward?
Well, the administration insists that it does, but they have been pretty short on specifics, including when pressed by journalists, as Mayorkas was in that interview, for example. He was asked, okay, well, what are you doing to make sure that all of these migrant children are housed safely? When can you tell us that they will all be in an appropriate facility? And he wouldn't give a timeline. He simply said, we're moving as quickly as possible. At times, some in the administration have said to people who might want to cross the border, don't come now. Others have said, don't come at all. So there has been a little bit of a mixed messaging. And so while administration officials say that they are working as quickly as possible to identify facilities where some of these children who are currently being held at the border in adult detention facilities that really aren't appropriate. They haven't said which facilities they are going to open for these kids and how quickly they could be up and running, and what exactly they're doing in the home countries to get the message across to both individuals who might want to come to the border or people who might be looking to shuttle them here for financial gain, that you should not make this trip. We haven't seen a lot of evidence yet that that message is really getting out there in these Central American countries, either via Twitter or from the U.S. embassies there, so that people know they shouldn't take this undertake this journey in the first place.
Nancy, we learned that Axios obtained photos of a border facility from a member of Congress. What can you tell us about the photos? And, you know, frankly, why isn't the White House allowing the press full access to any of these facilities?
The White House has said that they are going to grant access to a group of journalists, but they haven't told us when, and they haven't told us which journalists. They say that there are a lot of sensitivities involved, especially when you're talking about children and you don't want to identify those kids. But that's one of the details we're still waiting to hear about is when, you know, this is an administration that talks a lot about transparency. So when will we be given that transparency and allowed to see the conditions that children and adults are being kept in?
So, Nancy, how is the coronavirus being handled at the border, especially if many migrants are being grouped together where social distancing is not an option?
Right. So that was one of the problems for a while, actually, was that some of these detention facilities that were suited for children didn't have the maximum number of kids in them because of concerns about COVID. And recently, those restrictions were relaxed when U.S. health officials felt that there really wasn't a high risk of a spread of COVID among kids in particular. We do know that people who are allowed into the U.S. to await a hearing on their status, or if they're apprehended, they do get tested by Border Patrol. If they do test positive for COVID, they are sent to a hotel where they essentially have to quarantine under supervision until they're better. And one of the arguments that U.S. officials have been making is that, look, this, you know, sure, there's a concern that people who are coming across the border might bring coronavirus with them, but it's far from the only cause of an increase in coronavirus cases in a place like Texas, where the governor himself has just relaxed a lot of restrictions like mask wearing. And so they say that there isn't an indication right now that border crossings are a major driver of the coronavirus epidemic in border communities.
Nancy, before we let you go, let me ask you about President Biden's first press conference that he is scheduled to hold this week. I believe it's on the 25th of March. It's interesting, Nancy. Certainly the president and the American people have a right to know and to hear from the president of the United States. On the other hand, polling suggests that most Americans are more concerned about relief, about getting back to work, about getting their kids back to school. And so I'm wondering what you're hearing from the Biden team. Has this been sort of a winning strategy, given that President Biden's polling numbers are pretty strong, given that his approval is pretty strong, that they haven't felt the need to have President Biden speak directly to you and the rest of the White House press corps, or if they think that this has now become a way for the Republicans to sort of batter the administration as to why he's not being more forthcoming with the American people by holding one of these press conferences?
So what the White House has argued is that while President Biden hasn't held a formal press conference until this week, that he's certainly answered plenty of questions from reporters. Anytime he has events, reporters like myself and others who are in the room can shout questions at him. Sometimes he answers, sometimes he doesn't. He just did a sit-down interview last week with George Stephanopoulos. So the White House is arguing that it isn't as if he has been sort of closed off from the press. But it's clear that they wanted to wait until he had one major victory under his belt, and that is the $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief package signed into law, and that he wanted to come into his first press conference in a position of strength, having something to tout, something to talk about, a concrete accomplishment to show to the press and the world. And the White House is really banking on the fact that most of the American public really doesn't doesn't care whether he's answering questions in a formal press conference setting or in a one-off fashion at various events. Obviously, it matters a lot to us, and we're hoping that he takes a lot of questions at this first press conference. We've been told that perhaps as many as 40 journalists will be able to be in the room. Let's see how many of them he calls on. I'll put in my plug right now, hoping that he calls on me and CBS News, and any questions you guys have that you want to send my way, I'll be very appreciative. But this is someone who, once he gets started, he tends to enjoy the back and forth. So hopefully that'll be the case on Thursday.
Yeah, that sounds pretty. It's interesting. I've only ever been at one presidential press conference in my life as a reporter. It was when President Obama was traveling through Africa, and he was in Senegal. And I didn't know. I don't know if this changes from administration to administration, Anne-Marie and Nancy, but he was, I guess, given a list by the press secretary, and he had a list of the reporters that he knew he was going to call on in advance. Do we know if that's the way President Biden expects to operate, or is it just sort of random the way President Trump was? He just would call on whoever, I guess, shouted the loudest.
That is typically the way the Biden White House operates, although certainly he also has the ability to call on someone at the spur of the moment. And especially, I believe, since this is the start of his administration, he's not as familiar with all the names of the journalists who cover him as he might be a few years from now. He'll definitely be relying on the advice of his staffers as to who he should call on and in what order.
Very cool. All right, Nancy Cordes for us at the White House. Nancy, thank you very much.
You're welcome.